Chapter 15. The Queen of the Night, Part 2. Being proclaimed the Queen of the Night was not all that it was cracked up to be. First of all, Bindi, being intelligent, had left the party to retire early, so I was on my own. Diana was not going to be any help at all with the dilemma that faced me, because she was too caught up in her roadie. There I was winging it, feeling trapped under the glass, with a promise yet to keep, involving a kiss. I thought that I might lose it, wading through all the dynamics, churning in the river of doubt, to have a real conversation with Anthony. I contemplated pensively sitting next to Lucas on how to push forward in the right direction. I didn't want Anthony to have the wrong idea about me, but really, he did just say kiss, and that was all. My mind drifted to the triple chocolate cake dessert waiting for me, and that was when I was rudely interrupted by Lucas asking to take my picture. "What?" I asked, as I came crashing down to reality, wondering if I had misheard him. So he asked again, and I replied, no, rather flatly, followed by, "Why do you want to do that?" "Why not?" he queried. "I don't like having my picture taken," I said with a tone in my voice that meant business. He took the opportunity to point to a magazine on the coffee table in front of us, with a supermodel on the cover, and said, "You could be her." Clearly perplexed, not understanding his meaning, I said, "What? What do you mean?" He tried some convincing, saying, "You could be on the cover of that magazine. You could be a supermodel, just like that." Now the confusion gave way, and I just felt really annoyed and somewhat patronized. I kept it at bay, responding in an even tone of voice. "No, I couldn't. Stop teasing me." "I'm not teasing you," he said firmly, and asked for input from the room. Great, I thought. Let's all have a group discussion about my potential as a supermodel. She could be on the cover of that magazine. She could be a model, couldn't she? Several of the crew said yes. Well, that makes it true, I thought, sarcastically, unconvinced. Lucas said, "Anthony, you tell her." Anthony looked at me and said, "Yes, you could be on the cover of that magazine. You're beautiful." I could feel the blood in my cheeks as I smiled, shyly blushing. "Now you're all teasing me." "No, we're not," said Colin, my Irish friend. "We have a wall of photos and stories of all the beautiful people we meet on the road, and we want to put your picture there. Come on, just one picture. If you don't like it, we'll tear it up." I honestly thought he was teasing me, but he wasn't. Several of the crew were nodding in agreement. Oh, how could I turn down that Irish charm oozing from every pore? "Do you promise?" I asked incredulously. "If I don't like it, it's going into the trash, in pieces," I said firmly, planning to tackle anyone who didn't agree. "Agreed," said Colin. Lucas nodded in agreement as Colin held up the Polaroid camera and said, as only an Irishman could, "Smile for the camera." I glared, much like a mother trying to please a bunch of children who just wouldn't let it be. He captured the photo and we waited for it to process. Lucas asked me how old I was while we were waiting. I told him that I was 16. "When is your birthday?" he asked. "In January," I said. "See?" he told the room. "She's almost 17. She'll be 18 in a little over a year." Colin handed me the processed photo for my approval. I took a good look at it, knowing there might be long-term consequences to being put on a wall that traveled internationally along with the show. It wasn't the best photo in the world, but it wasn't terrible either. I looked like I was really pissed off because I was. There was a level of fierce determination in my stony gaze, staring back at me. I handed it back to Colin, who thanked me, and sat back down on the couch. As Lucas began talking quietly with some other members of the crew, I used the rare opportunity that had devoured his attention to slip away again, because I had seen Anthony suddenly depart, and he seemed angry or upset. I went in search of him down the hall, in stealth mode, sock-footed, and peered into another open door. He was there, sitting on the bed, surrounded by what could only be described as energy vampires. There were two women that were older than me and most likely German, given their accents, standing next to him. I didn't want to intrude, in case he had changed his mind. so I was just going to leave quietly. That was when he said, "Come in." Could this be any more awkward than it already is, I wondered to myself. The women appeared to be in their 20s with perfect makeup and dressed to the nines. I was in jeans, a green t-shirt, and socks, feeling very unsophisticated, tumultuously riding the edge of 16-year-old innocence next to their seeming worldliness. I crept in cautiously, like a black cat in the shadows, exceedingly uncomfortable with the feeling in the room. I said polite hellos and was going to leave quickly when Anthony asked me to sit down on the bed in front of him. I sat down at the far end of the bed, feeling hyper-aware, and stared at the plain light blue bedspread laid out like miles between the two of us. He began talking to me, deliberately ignoring the two older girls, waving one of them away as though she were an annoyance, and nothing more. By this point, they were fawning over his beautiful, long, dark hair and going on about it whilst touching it, as though he were some sort of exotic animal. I felt nauseated by the entire scene as it unfolded before me. I couldn't hide my disgust with their apparent objectification of him because it felt like sacrilege. It was obvious to me that their only real interest in him was as a rock star and not as a person at all. I thought that I might vomit and started to get up to leave, making an excuse that I had to find my friend, Diana. Anthony's eyes never strayed from me during the whole display, with the women petting his hair as though he were a dog, while asking him ridiculously shallow questions, in my humble opinion, about how he kept it so shiny. "Don't leave," he said more softly. "Come sit right here." And he patted the bed directly in front of him. His tone was inviting and non-demanding, so I complied, feeling intensely uncomfortable about it. It felt somehow necessary due to the earlier conversation that had been interrupted by Lucas. As I sat down on the bed in front of him, I developed a terrible new case of shyness. So I stared down at the bed, just as I had stared at the ground when we met, not wanting to look up at him. Time was non-existent, while the two German girls continued to fawn over him, and he brushed them away, as though they were flies buzzing around his head. He consistently ignored them, keeping his focus on me, without looking away from me for a second. This level of communication surpassed words, and was clear, direct, and unmistakable. He didn't want anything to do with them. He wanted me, for reasons that I could not even begin to fathom. The level of scrutiny and depth of connection between us became apparent to everyone in the room, including me. I could feel the immeasurable weight of the moments with his gaze on me, as though they were grains of sand pouring over me, filling up an hourglass around me, held by the hands of time. Suspended in that space, there was a heaviness on my shoulders, and I knew that I needed to look up at him no matter how difficult I might find it. It was glaringly obvious that my authenticity was intoxicating to him, because he still wanted me, even though there were other girls in the room, ready and willing to bed him. I felt him searching to my core, though the reason for it still eluded me. I reached down into the well of my own soul and pulled up my courage to face him, eye to eye, with whatever grace was instilled in me by my Maker. This intrinsic, invisible truth was carried within me, and whether he could see it yet, he certainly could feel it. It was imprinted on my soul, and was obviously reaching out to him from a timeless level, beyond current appearances. I slowly and deliberately lifted my head up and looked into his eyes as everything else in the room faded away. To say that these encounters with him were strange would be an understatement. They were beyond description. Anthony's eyes were languid and deep, like soft, glistening pools in the very pale lamplight of the room. As I met his gaze and did not try to hide from it any longer, I noticed that his eyes appeared to be glazed over, and his focus was somewhat diffuse. His face lost expression, taking on a peaceful appearance, and I could tell that he was looking slightly above me, around my head and shoulders. This was curious to me, because it took a great deal of effort to look him in the eyes, and though he was looking at me, he was also looking through me. Someone once told me that to see an aura, you had to look at a person indirectly and allow your gaze to soften while you look past them. This is exactly what he seemed to be doing for an excessive amount of time that for anyone with normal social mores was far too long. But this wasn't a normal situation, was it? It was far from it, happening within the context of a rock band, high on the energy of a show, now adrift in the afterglow, where anything goes. The German girls remained quiet and waited because they were not invited into the silent world being created by Anthony and me. He searched my soul for reasons of his own that had everything to do with him and what he needed. In my entire life, I had never been asked to be so consciously present for anyone until now. I knew that to run away from it would be counterproductive because he was a man in desperate need of something true. He was reaching out to me to find what he was looking for, something that he couldn't find night after night in arenas all over the world, filled with vacuous, superficial adulation. So many people deferred to him as if he were a king, and he felt undeserving of it all. The simplicity of a boy and a girl maybe falling in love was something real. In me, he recognized a kindred spirit, and maybe he might find himself deserving after all, in a way that he never imagined possible. He felt that he was on shaky ground, and that every show was an audition that he was not allowed to fail, because all bets were on him. He had too much, too soon, already, and it was difficult for him, because the stress was overwhelming. I had no hidden agenda to wade through. Rather, an elixir of innocence and purity dropped almost into his lap. I treated him like a human being. I offered a reflection to him from the eyes of non-judgment and unconditional love. After what seemed like forever, suspended in a realm of sweetness, he crashed like a wave back to earth with a jolt of revelation as his eyes widened, and he reacted with some distanced consternation. "Well, I guess you better get back to your friend," he said, after a brief, unfinished sigh, sounding as frustrated as he must have felt. It was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and everyone was almost in a dreamlike state, and maybe even feeling a little cranky. My common sense ability to be practical, even in love, suddenly became a tiresome yet tremendous strength. I sat unmoved for a moment, floating back down into reality. I looked at him, questioning his resolve, wondering if he was sure, because I knew that I didn't deserve any undue consternation. He said again, "Go on, find your friend," sounding less bitter about it. So not being one to hesitate, and to his unhappy surprise, I did. There was no point in talking with him in the present company. I roused myself from the trance-like state that permeated the atmosphere and left him there with the 2 German girls. As I headed down the hall, I discovered Diana, seemingly having had her own spiritual experience. As we passed in the hall, I asked she and her roadie Sam to come back to the main room for a while. When I returned, Lucas asked where I had been, and I told him that I was just down the hall where I found Diana. She and Sam walked in shortly after me, confirming the truth of it. Surprisingly, Anthony also returned within 5 minutes, obviously bored with the German girls, and went over again to the opposite corner of the room to continue what seemed like a ridiculous game between us. He must have thought better of dismissing me, but now I was unsure as to how to interpret his behavior, and wondered what he could be thinking as he shot me a furtive glance from across the room. The glances were cast for the rest of the night, until like a fire that leaves only glowing embers, the party began to die down, as it was getting close to 3:30 a.m. at this point, and we were all feeling it. That was when Anthony shot me a look and made a show of standing up and announcing his departure with an official good night to the room. He said that he was leaving to go and get some rest, which left me feeling slightly panicked. I had no good reason to get up and follow him like he clearly wanted me to do. I sat there debating for a few seconds how to slip out without drawing any attention to myself until I couldn't stand it anymore. I popped up like a cork on the water. Lucas stopped talking and said, "Where are you going?" "I'm just going to go get some air." Lucas was not about to let that happen, responding, "Just sit down and relax. We're leaving in a few minutes." Knowing that I couldn't just run out after Anthony without being completely obvious, I sat back down feeling somewhat defeated by the entire situation. Judging by the look he had given me on his way out the door, Anthony completely regretted dismissing me earlier. I pondered the entire scenario underneath a poker face of inscrutability. He certainly hadn't spent any time at all with the two German girls, and, for his own reasons, he followed me back to the slowly dying party. I thought about our age difference, but didn't allow myself to completely acknowledge that he may have had an internal debate about my age. After Caesar left the party, the only other person standing in the way of Anthony was Lucas. That was about the time that Lucas announced our departure as well. It seemed that Lucas and Diana's roadie Sam were roommates. Diana pulled me aside and explained to me how perfect it was for all of us to go off to their room together to get some sleep. As we went into the hall, Diana and Sam walked ahead of us. I stopped Lucas, looked directly into his eyes, and explained clearly that I needed to speak to him about his expectations regarding what was and was not going to happen between us tonight. I had abandoned all hope of being with Anthony at this point, and understood that Lucas had an attraction to me too. I told him that I was a virgin, and that I was going to stay that way. I explained, while he thoughtfully listened, that in the past I had some trouble with someone that didn't understand that concept. It created serious problems for me, and I won't go through that again, I said with complete conviction. I stated that I was very clearly not going to have sex with him, and said, if that's what you want, I'll leave right now, as I turned to face the empty hall ahead. He listened to me with real concern, processing what he had just heard, and said, no, don't do that. You don't have to leave. I promise I won't do anything you don't want me to do. He looked me straight in the eyes, and I knew that what he said was genuine. So it was settled, and we went to the room together. I felt exhausted and confused by the turn of events as I glanced around the Spartan room. A smaller standard room with double beds, it was nothing exciting nor inviting, just a place to lay your head. Diana and Sam climbed into their bed, whispering and talking softly, much better suited to each other than myself and Lucas. He offered me a place beside him on the bed, which I reluctantly accepted. He asked me if we could make out for a little bit. I really didn't want to, but I said okay anyway. He reached over to the lamp, put out the light, and then he began to kiss me. It was soft and sweet, but it wasn't Anthony, and I couldn't pretend that it was. It was almost over before it even began. A kiss here, a caress there, and he knew that I just wasn't into it.